World History Vault presents the ritual Rome buried. Picture this. The year is 186 BCE. You are a Roman father. Your family is respected, wealthy, secure. You've arranged an excellent marriage for your daughter. The alliance is favorable, the dowry generous, the future stable. She's 16 years old. Educated, carefully raised, taught obedience, modesty, duty. Everything a Roman bride is supposed to be. The wedding ceremony unfolds perfectly. The prayers are spoken. The omens are favorable. The feast is lavish. Your daughter smiles when she should, performing happiness the way she's been trained to do. And then, when the public celebration ends, something else begins. Your daughter is led away for the final ritual. The one no one explains in detail. The one never discussed in polite company. The one every Roman family knows exists but pretends not to see. As she's taken from the hall, she turns back once. Her eyes meet yours. There's a question there, not spoken, but unmistakable. You do not answer it. You look away, not because you don't love her, not because you're cruel, but because you know what is about to happen, and you know you cannot stop it. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have fought the system? Let's see who's brave enough to answer honestly. The ritual Rome buried. This is a ritual Rome buried so deeply that even ancient historians avoided naming it directly. What survives comes in fragments. Legal language without explanation, censored plays, sealed chambers beneath temples, names carved into stone without context. What I'm about to tell you is not a myth. It's drawn from surviving legal documents, archaeological evidence, and ancient writers who hinted at something they couldn't fully describe. Between roughly 300 BCE and 200 CE, Roman marriage wasn't simply a private contract between families. It was also a religious transaction. Legal sources make clear that a marriage wasn't fully valid until certain sacred requirements were met. Requirements overseen not by husbands, but by religious authorities. Later medieval writers would describe similar concepts using the term jus primi noctis. That phrase doesn't appear in Roman legal texts. But Roman sources point toward a ritual framed as an offering to the gods, sometimes reconstructed under the name deditio deorum, a symbolic giving over before marriage could be completed. The terminology matters because nothing about this was described as violence. It was described as duty. The legal trap. Under Roman law, marriage transferred a woman from the authority of her father to that of her husband. This transfer was called manus, literally the hand. A woman passed from one hand to another. But legal and religious sources suggest this transfer couldn't occur automatically. Before a woman could fully become a wife, she had to be purified. That word appears again and again. Purification. Purification wasn't metaphorical. It was a ritual act overseen by religious authorities, priests described in legal language as the guardians of divine will. Among the most prominent were those associated with Bona Dea, the good goddess, whose cult focused on fertility, reproduction, and the protection of Roman households. Her rites were secret, restricted, and legally protected from scrutiny. Roman religion operated on exchange. You offered something to the gods, and the gods granted favor in return. Crops, fertility, protection, stability. Marriage was no exception. But here, the offering wasn't wine or grain or sacrificial animals. It was the bride herself. Imagine what that meant in practice. You're 16, perhaps 17. You've been raised to believe that marriage is your highest duty. You know obedience. You know silence. You know endurance. What you don't know, because no one tells you, is that before you belong to your husband, you must first belong to the gods. And the gods require proof. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button. This story gets darker, and World History Vault is the only place telling it. The underground chambers. Across Rome, archaeologists have uncovered underground chambers beneath major temples. These spaces aren't burial crypts. They aren't storage rooms. They share unsettling similarities. Stone platforms shaped like beds. Channels cut into floors for liquid drainage. Heavy doors designed to lock from the outside. In 2003, excavations beneath the temple long associated with Bona Dea on the Aventine Hill revealed one such chamber in unusually preserved condition. The most disturbing feature wasn't the architecture. It was the writing. Carved into the walls were names. Hundreds of them. All female. Many accompanied by dates. When compared with surviving records, those dates align with known Roman wedding celebrations. British archaeologist Catherine Johns, who spent 3 years documenting the site, concluded cautiously that these inscriptions recorded women who had undergone a ritual connected to marriage eligibility. She noted that the nature of the ritual was not explicitly stated. That phrase appears often in academic writing. It signals restraint, not ignorance. After the public wedding, the bride wasn't taken home by her husband. He was excluded. Instead, she was escorted by female attendants, often older women who had undergone the same rite, to the temple. She was led downward, away from light, away from witnesses, stone steps, cold air, a chamber beneath the city. The sources differ on what happened next. Some suggest one priest. Others imply several. The inconsistency itself is telling. What survives are echoes. The playwright Plautus, writing in the early 2nd century BCE, alluded to such rites in a comedy later heavily censored. In one surviving fragment, a character remarks, "The gods take their portion before any man." Another asks what the bride receives in return. The answer, purification, if she survives it. That line doesn't appear in later copies. The philosopher Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BCE, refers to the rites of bona dea in language that's unusually direct. His words survive only because a single manuscript escaped medieval erasure. He writes, "They call these rites sacred, but they are terror. What the priest claims to offer the gods, he takes for himself, and the law shelters the theft by naming it divine." Comment below, how did they get away with calling this sacred? Let's discuss how systems of abuse protect themselves. The silence protocol. What made this practice so difficult to expose, both in antiquity and now, wasn't a lack of victims. It was the law. Roman women who underwent sacred rites weren't merely discouraged from speaking about them. They were legally forbidden. Certain religious ceremonies were classified as mysteria, sacred acts protected by secrecy statutes. To reveal them wasn't framed as testimony. It was framed as impiety. The Lex Voconia, passed in 169 BCE, included provisions governing religious disclosure. Women who revealed the contents of sacred rites could be charged with impiety, punished with exile, property seizure, or death. This is why the historical record feels incomplete. This is why historians encounter gaps, euphemisms, and evasive language. The victims were legally silenced. The perpetrators called it sacred, and the men who recorded history were often beneficiaries of the system. But silence isn't the same as forgetting. And sometimes, when speech is forbidden, people find other ways to leave evidence. Speaking without words. In the 1920s, archaeologists excavating a villa on the outskirts of Pompeii uncovered a sealed chamber. It wasn't closed by volcanic ash. The doorway had been deliberately bricked up before the eruption. Inside was a fresco. At first glance, it depicted a conventional Roman wedding scene. The bride stood at the center, the groom beside her, guests gathered. All familiar iconography. But in the background, partially obscured, was another scene. A woman being led downward by robed figures, her body angled away from the celebration, her head turned back, one arm reaching toward a man who wasn't following. The archaeologist who documented the fresco made a striking observation. The hidden figure's face, barely visible, was painted with greater precision and emotional detail than the bride at the center of the image. Someone wanted that face to be seen. They couldn't describe the ritual openly. That would have been illegal. But they could paint it. They could hide it. And they could hope someone, someday, would understand. That's not passive acceptance. That's documentation. The veil that hid everything. After the ritual concluded, the bride was returned to the wedding celebration. Hours had passed. Sometimes an entire day. Roman wedding customs include a detail that puzzled historians for generations. The bride appeared before her husband wearing a veil called the flammeum, a thick, brightly colored cloth. What made this unusual wasn't the veil itself, but the rule surrounding it. The veil was never removed. Not during the feast, not during the procession, not even during consummation. For centuries, scholars interpreted this as modesty, an expression of Roman virtue and decorum. But a closer look at Roman medical literature suggests another explanation. Feminist historian Amy Richlin, examining ancient gynecological texts, highlighted a passage written by the physician Cyrenus in the 2nd century CE. In a treatise on women's health, Cyrenus notes that newly married brides often exhibited signs of recent physical trauma. He advises physicians and husbands alike. The veil serves a double purpose. It preserves modesty, and it prevents the husband from observing signs of the purification rite, which might provoke improper questions. Read that again. The veil didn't symbolize virtue. It concealed evidence. The bride couldn't speak about what had happened. That was illegal. The husband was discouraged from noticing. That was custom. And any distress was explained away as nervousness, fear, or inexperience. The system didn't require universal belief. It required compliance. And for generations, it worked. The woman who spoke. In 186 BCE, the system nearly collapsed. That year, a Roman woman named Hispala Ficinia went before the consul and described abuses within the Bacchanalia, secret religious rites that had been operating across Italy. Her testimony, recorded by the historian Livy, described underground chambers, sexual violence carried out under religious authority, and victims bound by silence laws. The Senate reacted with shock. Investigations were launched. Priests were arrested. Rites were banned. Leaders were executed. Thousands were punished. Rome wanted to make an example of the Bacchanalia. But something else happened during that investigation. Several women attempted to testify about marriage purification rituals, rites connected not to foreign cults, but to Roman tradition itself. The Senate refused to hear them. According to Livy, the consul Spurius Postumius dismissed the requests with a statement that revealed everything. The Bacchanalia are foreign corruptions. The rites of Bona Dei are Roman tradition. We do not investigate tradition. Those words are the backbone of every system that survives abuse. Call it ancient, call it sacred, call it tradition, and suddenly it becomes untouchable. The women who attempted to testify were warned to remain silent or face charges of impiety. Most complied. One did not. Her name doesn't survive. She stood in the forum and publicly described what had happened to her beneath the temple. Within hours, she was arrested, charged with impiety and public obscenity, exiled to Sicily, forbidden from returning to Rome, forbidden from speaking to Roman citizens. She disappears from the historical record. But not everything disappears. In 1964, archaeologists discovered graffiti carved near the Roman Forum. The lettering style and surrounding context date to approximately 180 BCE, just a few years after the Bacchanalia scandal. It reads, "Tradition is what monsters call their crimes when no one stops them." Someone carved that message into stone at the center of Roman political power. Someone risked everything to leave it behind. Hit that like button if this is making you question everything you learned about Rome. How it finally ended. The ritual didn't vanish. It evolved. By the late 1st century BCE, elite families began to find ways around it. Instead of submitting their daughters to full purification rites, they paid for symbolic ceremonies. Rituals without chambers, without descent, without physical contact. The priests accepted these substitutions. Of course they did. Because this had never truly been about religion. It was about power. Once wealth could buy exemption, the nature of the system became impossible to ignore. Among elite families, the practice gradually faded. Among the poor, it didn't. They couldn't afford alternatives. The satirist Juvenal, writing around 100 CE, noted this disparity with bitter clarity. The poor still offer their daughters to the old gods. The rich offer gold instead. The system didn't end because it was recognized as wrong. It weakened because participation became optional for those with power. And that distinction, who can opt out and who cannot, reveals everything about what the system was designed to protect. The ritual didn't collapse because Rome experienced a moral awakening. It ended, where it ended at all, because powerful men decided they no longer wanted it touching their own families. As long as the consequences fell on other people's daughters, the practice was defended as ancient, sacred, and necessary. The moment it threatened elite households, it became negotiable. That single fact tells you everything. What scholars looked away from. For centuries, classical scholars minimized or dismissed accounts like these. They described the evidence as fragmentary. They warned that ancient sources were unreliable. They suggested exaggeration, misinterpretation, or later invention. They did everything except confront the pattern itself. Why? Because acknowledging this practice forces an uncomfortable conclusion, that Rome, so often praised as the foundation of Western law and civilization, embedded coercion and sexual exploitation into rituals presented as sacred and lawful. It means admitting that Roman marriage wasn't merely a private contract between families. It was a transaction that, in certain contexts, placed women's bodies under religious authority before transferring them to husbands. That realization destabilizes the traditional story of Roman virtue, order, and progress. So scholars hesitated. They focused on what could be safely admired: architecture, engineering, jurisprudence. And they avoided asking what those systems cost the people with the least power. But in the last few decades, that avoidance has become harder to maintain. What can no longer be ignored? Archaeology doesn't argue. Underground chambers exist beneath temples long associated with marriage and fertility rites. Inscriptions exist, names carved by women who left no other testimony. Legal language exists, vague, euphemistic, but persistent. Literary references exist, censored, fragmented, but consistent in tone. Individually, each piece might be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern. In 2018, a research team affiliated with the American Academy in Rome published a comprehensive review of available evidence relating to premarital purification rituals in Roman religious practice. Their conclusion was measured, careful, and difficult to ignore. They wrote, "The evidence strongly suggests certain purification rites associated with marriage involve coercive sexual acts carried out under religious authority, reinforced by legal and social structures that prevented resistance or accountability." That's academic language. Translated plainly, this happened. It wasn't accidental. And the system protected itself. Comment below. Why did it take until 2018 for scholars to admit this? Let's talk about who gets to write history. The names on the walls. You can stand in Rome today and see the remains of these temples. On the surface, there's nothing dramatic. Broken columns, scattered stone. Tourists pass by without stopping. But beneath the ruins, the chambers remain. And on the walls, the names are still there. Julia, Cornelia, Flavia, Fulvia. Women whose fathers brought them here. Women who underwent rituals they were forbidden to describe. Women who couldn't testify, couldn't accuse, couldn't refuse. So they did the only thing they could. They carved their names. Not as rebellion, not as protest, but as proof of existence. I was here. This happened to me. They left those words without letters, trusting that someday, someone might understand what they weren't allowed to say. We found them. We understand. And we refuse to let Rome's version of history be the only one that survives. The question for us. This is not only a story about abuse. It's also a story about resistance. Quiet, dangerous, and easily erased, but real. There was the woman who stood in the forum and spoke, knowing exactly what would happen to her. She wasn't saved, but she refused to pretend. There was the artist who painted the hidden fresco in Pompeii, carefully rendering a face meant to be overlooked, trusting that someone in the future might see it. There was the person who carved a sentence into stone near the Roman Forum, naming tradition for what it was. There were families who found ways to avoid the ritual, not because they challenged the system openly, but because they chose their daughter's safety over unquestioned obedience. None of these people stopped the machine on their own, but they documented it. They left traces. And those traces survived Rome's power. Systems of abuse rarely collapse because everyone suddenly agrees they're wrong. They collapse because enough people refuse to participate. Because enough people withdraw consent. Because enough people leave records. Because enough people decide that tradition doesn't excuse cruelty. Before you go, ask yourself this. How many other traditions across history function the same way? How many customs we call sacred were actually systems of control? How many names are still hidden in sealed rooms, waiting to be noticed? The Roman marriage purification ritual isn't unique because it was especially cruel. It's unique because enough evidence survived for us to see it. The machinery behind it, authority disguised as holiness, violence reframed as duty, silence enforced by law, appears again and again across cultures and centuries. The question isn't whether it happened elsewhere. The question is whether we're willing to investigate our own traditions with the same honesty. Rome couldn't answer that question. Can we? If this exposed something you were never taught, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications for World History Vault. This channel exists to uncover the practices powerful institutions tried to erase. Drop a comment telling me which part of this story shocked you most. And share this video, because these names deserve to be remembered. The names are still on the walls, waiting not for revenge, but for acknowledgement. And now that we've found them, we cannot pretend they were never there. We hear you.